Welcome, welcome everyone to Growing Your Workplace's Emotional Intelligence with Lessons from the Black Experience, brought to you by Eye Opening Enterprises. My name is Andrea Haro, and I am a program director at IOE. We are excited to host this exciting and timely webinar with an all-star panel lineup. Our first panelist is Amira Barger, the Executive Vice President in the Health Sector DEI for Edelman, a global communications firm. She is a data-driven organizational architect who leverages design thinking to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and solve complex challenges. She is a voice sorely needed for systemic change. Our next panelist is Courtney Smith, the Senior Manager of Legal Response and Enforcement at Etsy, where she leads the company's intellectual property enforcement team. Prior to joining Etsy, Courtney worked in legal policy and legal operations at Twitter and Facebook, respectively. A Bay Area native, Courtney now splits her time between the Bay Area and Washington, D.C., and brings the legal expertise needed to sustain policy-based change. Our final panelist is Jarrell Peterson, a senior leader in the tech industry who has spent the past 7+ years building global teams, working cross-functionally to resolve high-profile platform issues, and ensuring the platform's approach is communicated clearly and objectively to executives, internal teams, and external stakeholders, including NGOs, academics, and researchers. Jarrell is invested in leveraging research and strategic partnerships to address complex social and political issues with a strong focus on improving people's lives. Our moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Isaiah Pickens, CEO and founder of Eye Opening Enterprises. Dr. Isaiah Pickens is a licensed clinical psychologist, trauma expert, and CEO and founder of Eye Opening Enterprises, a professional development company specializing in professional development and culture change at the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and mental health. Dr. Pickens is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Fellow, a former assistant professor at NYU, and former assistant director at the UCLA Duke National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. He has been awarded by the American Psychological Association Early Career Achievement Award and the Black Enterprise BE Modern Man Award for his contributions to the field of psychology. Dr. Pickens aims to create systemic culture change through unlocking the full potential of individuals and organizations alike, moving the world from happy to healthy through psychological science. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Dr. Pickens is a proud graduate of George Washington University, Fordham University, and School Without Walls High School. He currently splits his time between his home in LA and Washington, D.C. Dr. Pickens, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I am so excited to be here with you all today for this timely conversation that we're going to have about understanding emotional intelligence in the workplace through the Black experience. And I remember the stories from when I was young of him coming in and seeing one of his sons or anyone doing a push-up and looking at them and say, boy, why are you exercising? Poor people don't exercise. You need to get another job. That was my pop or grandpa, in other words, who I heard so many stories about. He transitioned out of this world when I was young, so I didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time with him. But his stories and the stories I've heard about him speak about a man who fought for his place, not only in the world, but in the workplace. He would do things like people asking him for a cigarette, and he'd say, yeah, I got a cigarette. I got a whole bunch, not give him one of them because of the hard life he had seen. And one of the stories that stuck out most to me really spoke to his emotional intelligence in the workplace. Working at the post office, he was often during this time in the early 1900s having to train trainees, white trainees, who would eventually be his boss, knowing that he would never have an opportunity to be the boss of anyone who didn't look like him, but be the boss in general at a place that currently or was dealing with Jim Crow era, not necessarily segregation because they were in the North, but the ability to be able to move up as a person of color. And when we talk about emotional intelligence and the experience of having to navigate the workplace, his story is a story of so many Black people throughout the centuries in America who've had to figure out, how do I make a place for myself in the work I'm in while also being able to sustain my dignity? And what I think about when I think about his story isn't just his story in the context of where he was in history, but how his story reverberated throughout history. When we talk about emotional intelligence, we're talking about the ability to be able to understand how to use all of your emotional skills to achieve the goals that you have in the workplace, but also to stay well, have your own well-being outside of the workplace and in life. And this was something that you have to imagine how difficult it is to want to be a person who has your dignity in the workplace, provides for your family financially, but knows that you will deal with some of the aggressions or the challenges or the exclusion that your peers who don't look like you will experience. And there's so many beautiful lessons to learn from understanding just how much Black people in this country historically have had to navigate in the workplace in order to achieve the top goals and in order to achieve their potential in the workplace. And so as we think about this, one of the lessons that I draw from my grandfather's experience and the experience of so many Black Americans who came before us is that there are painful life experiences that actually create insights for solutions that seem insurmountable at the time. One of the things that I believe my grandfather had to do is he had to find a way to ensure that his value was seen and train someone else, but train them in a way so that they would still need him once they're his superior, once they're in charge of him. And this is something that so many people of color, people from historically oppressed groups have had to try to figure out in places where they don't have power. And one of the reasons for that has been because of a history of historical trauma. Historical trauma really speaks to this idea of a collective wounding that whole communities have experienced at the hands of the societies that they've been a part of, whether we're talking about slavery of Africans in America or lynchings during the Jim Crow era, or when we're talking about the mass genocide of indigenous people or Japanese internment or the Holocaust. All of these events were historical traumas that shaped how whole communities found what we call in the workplace psychological safety. That belief that I can manage the stress that's happening around me or reach out to someone who can help me manage that stress. One of the great researchers in this area, Dr. Joy DeGruy, talks about a concept called post-traumatic slave syndrome, where the coping skills that people who've been a part of historical traumas develop to manage the workplace may show up in ways that actually can hurt the health of the individual. She shares this amazing story that I'm going to share very briefly with you about a young man or a boy and his mother who were in the store, and his teacher was there. His teacher came by and said, "Your son is doing amazing in school." And this was a white teacher, and she said, "Oh, he's not doing so well. He's doing okay." And after reflecting on that, Dr. DeGruy said that she talked to that mother and said, "Why'd you downplay your son's achievement?" And the mother didn't really know, but what Dr. DeGruy traced that back to is during the time of slavery, when the master said, "Your son is doing great," that meant your son was going to the field and being in harm's way sooner. So you want to downplay how well he's doing so that you can protect him longer. These lessons don't get lost in just the family, in just the community, but they're brought to the workplace. And so the things that Black people do in order to use their emotional intelligence to achieve and to get promoted and to move forward in the workplace are also the same things that can create pain and can create the type of emotional energy that redirects them from doing their job, from being able to focus on that project, from being able to focus on building and supporting the productivity of the workplace, and instead focuses on them having and being able to make sure they can prove themselves, make sure that they can be seen as a valuable contributor or not be seen at all so that they aren't given work that isn't due to them, but because their value isn't seen the same way and we don't understand kind of the emotional energy that's being used to not only do the work, but to also deal with all of the other expectations that come from historical trauma and the pain that we've seen, all of a sudden, the workplace can become a place that has so many triggers. So today, we're going to talk with you not only about growing your workforce's emotional intelligence, but we also want to give you tools to think about how to create a workplace culture that really starts to not only heal Black people and people of color, but to help the whole workplace that you're a part of feel more inclusive, and be able to really start to address the deep needs that each of your members of your workforce have in what they do from day to day. And one of the first ways you can do that is by acknowledging the triggers from painful life experiences to build a more inclusive workplace. Now, everything I shared with you about my grandfather, about historical trauma, about Dr. Joy DeGruy, all of those issues create emotional stress. And I want you to imagine you have this level of emotional stress at your job. And on top of that, you have to do whatever project you need to work on. You have to manage whoever you need to manage. And then you get upset, you get frustrated, you get sad, you have these very intense feelings. And the first response that people have for you is, could you just calm down? I want to talk about it with you, but I just want to calm down. I share this because this is probably one of the most used or present triggers in the workplace, emotionally censoring those who have come from historically oppressed communities, saying that I want to hear what you say, what you have to say and your pain, but I want to hear it on my terms, not your terms. I don't need you to make it seem like I'm the one who should be guilty. I don't want you to yell at me. I need you to be calm during this experience. And we call that emotional censoring because it allows or it creates a space where the people who have less power at times, and when I mean power, I'm talking about the power to make decisions, the power to support the workforce, all of these different components, they have less power. And that means that they have to respond to calming down in order to keep their job, in order to get promoted. And it creates an emotional weight that makes it very hard to feel healthy, and it leads to greater burnout. And so part of acknowledging the triggers is giving people the space to express themselves emotionally in the way that feels best for them and not trying to censor that. Now, this is just the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. And I want to invite our amazing panel onto the screen because I want to hear from you all and really get a sense of this experience and thinking about the experiences that have reminded you of the pain or struggle of your parents or grandparents or our ancestors as Black people, and how that's impacted you and how has that pain shown up at work, because all of this can also impact our mental health. I'm going to start with Amira. If you want to just share your initial reflections on how we navigate this. So Amira, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Pickens. Good to be here with you all today. You know, I was thinking about this question, and as you were talking, when you mentioned the pain and the acknowledgement and the words of, calm down. I worked for a global organization and I was the head of development and marketing. And what that meant is I went to our 6 board meetings throughout the year. And at the time, we were revising our communications narrative and market positioning. So naturally, I invited some of my key team members who were deep in the work. And I brought them in to actively engage our board members and our executive team as we were proof testing some of our positioning and messages. And the chief of staff, a white male, excitedly invited my team of 4 women, most of whom were Black and brown, into the boardroom and showed them to their seats. And their seats were on the margins of the table, not at the table. They're at the back of a wall to the backs of board members. And he thought that was perfectly appropriate and fine. And the first question I usually get from people is, well, there must not have been any room at the table, right? Wrong. There was plenty of room at the table. And I approached the chief of staff about that. And he quipped that, my team gave him an attitude about the specific seats they were given in the boardroom to engage. And he didn't appreciate that. And he thought it was nice enough that they were just invited. And so for me, what this brings up is, to sit them at the margins, right? When they're meant to actively engage, to participate, it was microaggressive, it was typical. And it was this stark visual for me and my team of the reality that too many of us still have to face today. You're invited into the room, but you're not given a seat at the table. You're left on the margins without resources, support, power to invite others like you in or to engage in ways that are meaningful. And so is that really what we're calling progress, or is it performance art? And there's so many actions that could have been taken or enacted by the different leaders who were in that room and witnessed that happening before I typical, a Black woman entered and said something about it. And the tact and the tone of the team when I brought this up was, calm down. It's not that big a deal. They can sit at the margins. That's where they belong. So that's what this brings up for me in terms of some of those painful experiences that I think still show up for too many of us today.
Amir, I really love what you're saying in so many ways. One, because those microaggressions in the moment, this one microaggression may not seem like a big deal to people from the outside, but the cumulative impact and emotional drain that creates, it really doesn't set the company up for success because you're constantly having to use energy to protect yourself. And then the other thing that you shared that I think is so important for our audience to understand is that part of creating an equitable world and an inclusive world is not leaning on technicalities, right? Just like the emotional censoring, this is just the rules we have around how we set up our boardroom table. Instead of examining why are those rules there in the first place and how can we adjust it and not minimize the people who are having to take the energy to self-advocate for their own seat at the table. And so I think this is just a wonderful way for people to understand how this emotional intelligence and workplace culture intersect. And so Courtney, I would love to hear from you about how that built for you and your experience.
Sure. So when I was reflecting on this question, one thing that you brought up was your grandfather, and we talked a little bit about this. I feel like we'll talk about grandfathers probably a lot today. But one experience that I relate back to just my grandfather's struggle and pain in the workplace was there was a time I was working at a company, huge company, a really big stage in terms of the technology industry. And I had a manager who just, the microaggressions were bad. It was to the point where, I was keeping a running list of microaggressions, and they were so bad that, you start to get to the point of asking yourself, am I crazy or am I really experiencing these things? And are they really as bad as what I think they are? And so I started to talk to my grandfather like I usually do about work. And even though he's well outside of this industry and, he's a Black man born in 1939 in the South, like he doesn't know about technology. He doesn't really understand the corporate space as I understand it. But, I'm relaying these things to my grandfather, just really laying it out, all these experiences that I'm having with this manager who I think is being really, really aggressive towards me. And my grandfather, in his old Southern way and the way that he does while he's smoking his cigarette, he just looks up and he says, when I was 13, I worked at a hamburger place and I had a manager. And he was pretty terrible too. And he goes, he was in the Klan and everybody knew it. And at that moment, and that was all he said. And he left the rest of it for me to be inferred. And at that moment, I realized he had been through, a work experience where he had absolutely no agency, where actually his life and liberty were at jeopardy if he stepped out of line. And what he was trying to infer to me in that moment was, you have way more agency than what you believe. You can speak up and advocate for yourself in this situation. And you're really not in any real jeopardy in terms of, your livelihood and how you proceed from there. So when I think about painful experiences, that's one that really comes up for me in terms of what my grandfather experienced, because it really set the stage for how I proceeded in becoming an advocate for myself and for other people within my organization.
Courtney, I so appreciate that story, because part of what we're talking about too, and we'll get to this in more detail, is how do we draw from those experiences to really be able to deal with challenges that seem insurmountable? Because part of what you expressed by talking to your grandfather is he was able to expand your perspective. In our work, we call this reframe how you saw the challenge and said, in the grand scheme of things, maybe I do have more agency than I thought. And this challenge that seemed impossible, I can address it. And at the same time, I think this is the important part of this conversation, is that we have to understand microaggressions. And for those who don't know, simply put, is any kind of indignity that undermines your sense of humanity. And so even though it may seem small to other people, it's in some way undermining your sense of feeling seen whole as a whole human. And that can become very tiring. And the responsibility of constantly having to advocate for yourself leads to situations where you see only a few people Black people or people from other groups in some of the positions of power, not just because of structural racism and issues that we know are present, but also because it's just too much work. I don't have the energy to keep fighting and fighting. I'd rather do something else. And so, with that perspective, because we want to have workplaces that really invite everyone in, because that's when we have the best talent. That's when we position ourselves to actually be at the top of our field, regardless of what field you're in. And so with that backdrop, Jarrell, I'm wondering for you and your reflections on these questions, how did that show up for you?
For me, well, a lot of their experiences resonate with me specifically, but it's also in thinking about how my parents and grandparents were positioned in the workplace, is that for a lot of us, we're still the first and only. And that's been my struggle, particularly working in some of the biggest tech companies in the world. There have been times where I'm the first Black person on my team or within my entire organization globally. And these are teams that have been around for over a decade. And yet somehow I'm the first one. And from the day to day, that means I'm hyper visible. And I was talking to Courtney about this earlier, and it's that I don't really get the grace and the space to kind of figure it out and not make mistakes. And in tech, the mantra is often, it's okay to fail. But I always think it's important to clarify, well, who gets to fail? And I feel like if I were to fail, I'm somehow a reflection of all the capabilities of my entire race and everyone who's come before me and everyone who come after me. And this is reinforced on the day-to-day through those microaggressions, like, I wasn't sure what it would be like to work with someone like you, or wow, you are so smart and articulate, or in some cases, you are the first Black person I've ever partnered with on this kind of project. And going back to the points of microaggressions, is that these things are small in the grand scheme of things, but my partner describes them as like mosquito bites, right? And so like one or two, it's like, okay, put a little lotion on and you'll be fine. But when you get these bites every single day, and so you leave at the end of your quarter with hundreds, you're like, well, maybe there's a problem with mosquitoes. It's not me. That's an issue. And I think the compounding nature of this is where folks, I think, encounter the fatigue, or at least for me, that's how it's played out.
Jarrell, I really appreciate, I love that visual of the mosquito bites constantly getting at us, because yeah, we can deal with a couple of mosquito bites, but every day on end having mosquito bites, and then knowing that the people who are doing the same thing as you don't have those same mosquito bites, so they're free to just be like, hey. And I think a big part of this journey is for us really to create a space where we're better understanding the lived experience of others. Because here's what I want to be clear about, and I hope people are getting this from our conversation. Our conversation right now is not about shaming anyone in the process of moving toward a more compassionate and humanizing workplace. It's really being able to not make the conversation about the people who are not oppressed. It's about being able to make the conversation about the people who have experienced historical oppression and understand those lived experiences, so that we can actually create the kind of workplaces that we started talking about in 2020. And we all know that since then, there's been some fatigue, because it's so hard to make this type of system change. And so I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists, you all can go off camera for now. We're going to be right back with them in just a minute. Thank you for those wonderful answers to those questions. And so as we continue this conversation of understanding emotional intelligence in the workplace and drawing lessons, another story comes to mind. And Courtney already said it's going to be a lot of grandfather stories in here. And so I think about my grandfather on my maternal side. I was speaking about my grandfather on my paternal side earlier. On my maternal side, and he was a shoe repairman who was in the Deep South, and he put 10 children through school as both working as a shoe repairman and starting his own shoe repair clinic. An entrepreneur at the time of segregation and moving past segregation into the 60s, 70s, having to do all of this really by himself, in the sense of by himself to do the work, but in a partnership with my grandmother, who is a deeply spiritual woman, to move their family to a place that just wasn't imaginable in the early 1900s, a family or imaginable for the mainstream audience, right? Of course, there were wealthy people of color, Black people before segregation ended, but it was so few and far between. And seeing that Black middle class grow in the mid 1960s partially was because of people like my grandfather, along with the partnership of my grandmother, who were able to see opportunity, and despite all the challenges, to reach the level of success that they had the potential to. They had to find this deep resilience, and it's that resilience that I think allows us to be able to really draw on the experiences of Black Americans, the Black diaspora, to understand how resilience plays a role. I think, Courtney's example earlier around how her grandfather took that cigarette and said, yeah, my boss is from the Klan. Putting into perspective what those who came before us had to do in order to just get to baseline, to just get to a place where they can support their family, is an extreme amount of resilience. And this resilience shows up in so many ways in our workplaces, but I want to hone in on one particular form of how this resilience plays out, I believe, especially for Black people who are in positions of power. They're rising through the ranks, vice president, president of their company, and really having to have resilience that's rooted in exceptionalism. And to what Jarrell shared earlier, and Amira's story around the boardroom table, that idea of having to always show up as the best ever creates another level of emotional weight that is probably just as weighty as having to ensure that you are not constantly dealing with the triggers and the pain of your workplace as a whole. And so this exceptionalism means that, you have to work twice as hard for half as much, or at least those lessons that were taught to you as a kid still show up. And so you're not taking those days off that your colleagues may be encouraging you to take, because they see the burnout starting to happen, because or you feel at least, if you drop the ball, then everyone will see not only you as dropping the ball, but those who may look like you as dropping the ball as well. And here's the other piece where I really think it's important for us to understand emotional intelligence. So much of the history of Black American success in the workplace has been centered on entertainment. So before our modern renaissance of Black doctors and lawyers and Black people in the tech industry really being able to forge a way, the people who were most successful in the Black community were athletes. They were musicians. They were folks who were on the screen in some way. And that idea of entertainment is something that I think doesn't leave us. You all may notice, for those who came to this early to this webinar, we had a little music playing, we were going. My style of communicating may be different than psychologists that you have seen before. And that's probably both my roots in kind of being in the church and seeing preachers, but also understanding the power of entertainment and style, swagger, all of these different components in the Black community to get the respect, not only in the workplace, but this also happens within the community, to get the respect of your peers so that they know that you haven't sold out. They know that you still understand where you came from. Again, I say all of this because this creates a tremendous amount of emotional weight, having to, as W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, having this mass, this duality that we have to navigate. And when you're using your energy to navigate that duality, when you're using your energy to ensure that your swag is on point for the people in your community, but also you're able to get your work done and you're doing it in a way that excels beyond all your peers in your workplace, it creates such a weight for you to carry in this work. And so when we say study those who survive similar pain, study really speaks to an emotional intelligence skills that focus on reflecting on your personal story, reflecting on the story of people before you, and not stopping there. After you reflect, truly engaging in conversations and practices that allow you to, hopefully with some low stakes, with some trial and error, put into practice some of those same resilient skills that they use. And this is going to be so important that in terms of us being able to have brave conversations, which we're going to talk about as our final emotional intelligence skill. But what does this mean for the workplace? What this means for the workplace culture is we have to start asking those questions that allow us to understand what are the benefits and burdens on certain groups of people. What do I mean by that? Well, in our work that we do at Eye Opening Enterprises, we talk about something called the benefit and burdens analysis. It's being able to look at a workplace stressor and say, does this workplace stressor disproportionately impact one group of people and burden them? And does it disproportionately benefit another group of people and how it impacts them? I think about the work that we did with a actual tech department at a university. And one of the ways that can be a weight, emotional weight on people from historically oppressed groups, Black people dealing with trying to feel like they fit in, feel like they belong in the workplace, is the skills that are most naturally come to them aren't really honored or identified as skills core to the job description. So I'll give you a more specific example around that. A more specific example was with this tech department. One of the things that they were having trouble doing is hiring Black, brown, people of color. And I asked them, what is your job requirements? And so they gave me a lot of technical descriptions around the job requirements. I said, great. That sounds amazing. Well, do you also include some of these emotional intelligence skills, like being able to read what a person needs that you're doing tech support for, being able to think ahead around what they will want to ask you later so that you can be prepared for that and be ahead of your competition? And they said, no, we don't do that. And I said, these are skills that are more natural to people who've been in historically oppressed groups, because they're constantly in a place where they have to read the room. They have to see who is the person I can connect with, I can trust, who's the person I got to look out for to make sure that they, don't stereotype me or that they won't undermine the work that I'm doing in some way. And so you've cultivated these emotional intelligence skills over a lifetime. And now the places where you want to work are not actually seeing those as core to your job function, even though it has a real impact on how well the job is done for anyone who's in it, regardless of their background. And so part of this journey is being able to expand what we are deeming as valuable in the workplace. I'll give one last example, and then I really want to bring our panel back on to dive deeper into this discussion, because when we talk about this, one of the tools that we know has really been prominent over the past couple of years in this journey to understand how do we start to heal our nation, how do we start to bring some of these emotional intelligence lessons into the workplace, is a concept called radical healing. Radical healing is a way of addressing what we call identity-based wounds. They are wounds that are connected to important parts of who I am. The microaggressions that our panelists have been talking about may be identity-based wounds related to their race, but there's identity-based wounds related to our gender, sexual orientation, in terms of our immigration status, all of these wounds. And what radical healing says is that the pathway to healing isn't just by being able to gain knowledge on evidence-based practices or going to therapy. All those things are great. But the pathway to healing also involves being able to honor and acknowledge joy in the face of oppression. So we haven't solved all the problems. There's still a lot of challenges, but I'm still able to have joy, this deep inner sense of peace, calm, stabilization in this situation. Honoring that, celebrating that is important. But here's the other thing. The onus of changing systems should not be on the oppressed. And so we don't want to give that additional emotional weight. And at the same time, part of radical healing says, let's honor resistance. So instead of emotionally censoring people, you invite it. You say, hey, I want to create affinity groups in our workplace that don't just sit and talk about what's important, but they actually create policies that shape the rest of our workplace. And you don't have to be calm when you share these policies with me. I understand that this resistance that you're showing is the part of not only your healing, but the improvement of our workplace culture as a whole. And so with that being said, I invite our panelists to come back on screen. And I would love for you all to just share strategies that have helped you more effectively work as a Black person, support your mental health, what has been adversely impacting your mental health, and how have you seen workplaces channel this resilience or swag of the Black experience in both healthy ways and in ways that may not be in the best interest of the Black community. Let's start with Courtney.
Wow. In terms of strategies that I've used, just going back to the example I gave before, my biggest strategy is fearlessness. And on its face, that may not seem like a strategy, but what I've learned in the corporate space is that fearlessness, and I feel like my grandfather gave me permission to be fearless in how I operate, in my work. It really is a privilege, not everybody gets to come into work, it's not, I don't think, a strategy that works for everybody. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I think that is. But not everybody gets to come into a corporate space and be an advocate or be a challenger or be somebody who is going to speak up for them, not only themselves, because, we know as people who are historically marginalized, we can't just advocate for ourselves. We have to advocate for the entire marginalized population and everybody else. But it's a strategy that I've implemented in my own work to advance my own causes and also to advance other people's causes on the team. In terms of how it impacts my mental health is that when you are, someone who's going to be fearless and to challenge and to advocate for your team and for yourself, that often comes with some negative implications for people who do want to uphold the status quo. So, people who have been historically in positions of power often see, a quest for equity as a challenge to their power and as them losing out on something. So there is the impact to your mental health in terms of beginning to think, well, am I going to miss out on opportunities because I've become what is called a squeaky wheel? Or am I going to be labeled as difficult to work with? Am I going to not be invited to sit in or participate or give feedback on certain meetings or projects because I am the person who always is like, how does this impact marginalized communities? Being that person to speak up. So those are definitely ways that I think being that person who uses that sort of strategy has impacted my mental health. But on the flip side, like I said before, fearlessness kind of helps me cope with that because at the end of the day, my life and liberty are not at jeopardy. There are more jobs out there to get. And if I'm at a company that is, that doesn't appreciate my fearlessness, doesn't appreciate, how I challenge the system, then most likely it's not a company for me.
I just want to, I just want to give you one of those. and I love that. I love that fearlessness that you're talking about. And it's so necessary, and it's sad that it's necessary sometimes, right? And so Jarrell, just from that space, how has this impacted your mental health or how you've seen workplaces use the resilience of Black people in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned earlier about the stress and worry of performing excellence. And for me, that's been exhausting. And so one of the lessons my grandfather gave me is to set your mind. And he's been telling me this since I was 13. And it's like, this is how you get by. You have to be focused. You have to work hard and know that you're doing something that's bigger than you. And I remember my first few years at Twitter, I would spend lots of time after hours. I would work on the weekends, reading materials, researching considerations related to my work so that I could perform my best on the job. And in hindsight, I was simply set in my mind like my grandfather told me. But there were times where regardless of how much I prepped, I was still unprepared in meetings. And it wasn't until much later I realized that most of my colleagues were not only unprepared, but they were also very ill-informed about what they were doing. And for them, this was simply just making it up as you go. Like everyone says, we're building the plane while we're flying, or you're just ramping up. And so over time, I stopped being as hard on myself on these things. But I would say my friends and family have really helped keep me grounded in this. And in terms of how this shows up in the workplace, there's lots of ways it manifests in tech, but something I've been thinking a lot about over the past few years is being really conscious of what my own representation means to the company, with a particular focus on when and if I'm also benefiting as much as the company is by having me there as a Black person. And For example, I used to attend lots of recruiting events at HBCUs. And so the companies would fly you around and have you talk to prospective engineers and others. And in most cases, you're compensated for the travel. And then you have to work with your manager to figure out how you make up work and all of that stuff. But I didn't think to ask for more than that. But there was a time where I was featured on the careers website. And I can't tell you how many students at these HBCUs came up to me and were excited to see me in person, but also to let me know that like the reason they wanted to apply is because they saw me on the website and they saw me as a representation of the company's investment in inclusion. And at first I was like, well, great, bring everybody here. Y'all all want to work. But now I'm much more careful about how involved I get in those things because of the time and energy that comes from it, and from the fact that the company benefits so much more from me by attracting all this amazing talent, by having all these great conversations, by starting all these new deals that they ask me to consult with, particularly when the folks on the other end are people of color. And I don't think there's a right way to think about it, but I want workplaces to be conscious of, again, as people show up and be their authentic and amazing selves in these workplaces, are they also benefiting from their representation too?
That's so powerful. And it's that inner struggle I think we all have. We feel a responsibility to pave the way, but then we're asking ourselves, well, who's really benefiting from that? And are we true partners, not partners in work, but partners in profit, partners in being able to grow? And those questions by themselves are questions that we as a nation, we're not overly self-conscious about because we live in a capitalist society. But as people of color, sometimes it feels weightier because the journey to get here has been so hard, and thinking through who we can bring along with us. But should we really have that responsibility in terms of our mental and emotional weight is the question. And Amir, I just would love to hear from you around kind of how you've seen resilience channeled within the workplace.
What Jarrell was saying about intentionally choosing where you put your energy really is what I was thinking of too, and struck me. You know, I work as a DEI practitioner. And so often that means I'm in these places and spaces of leading really difficult or deep conversations, and people expect me to respond and educate and redirect. And that comes with a heavy emotional mental weight, and it can be reliving of trauma sometimes. And so I have to find really intentional and consistent ways to protect my mental health and peace. And I don't have a grandfather story, but I think back to my dad. He is a multi-degree black belt. So he practices martial arts. And if you know much about martial arts, there's a meditativeness to it, and a quietness and an honorable silence to how it is practiced. And I learned a lot of that from him about, meditating and pausing to take a moment to really sit with yourself. And he's also a great man of faith, in addition to working in tech back way in the 70s, 80s, and 90s before it was cool. He had a really bad experience in some of his workplaces with racists all around him. And so in addition to his work there, he was also, Tuesday nights, he did a Bible study. Wednesday nights, he did a prayer walk. Friday, he led our youth group. And on Saturday, his worship practice. And on Sunday, he was in the church. And so he also, protected his own mental space with leaning into his place of worship and his faith, and surrounding himself with community that looked like him, that understood him, that could pour into him. And I have to be really intentional about practicing that too, inside and outside of the workplace, and helping others have those tools as well, so that I can show up. As Courtney was saying, because in many instances, I'm the only representative of my community and people who look like me. And I also subscribe to the NAP ministry. And, I was thinking about one of their posts recently. They said, disrupt and push back against a system that views you as a machine. You're not a machine, you're a divine human being, and you need rest. And I try to remember that in the way that I show up in the workplace, that there are some moments where I am going to take up the mantle and educate, take up the mantle and respond, take up the mantle and represent for my whole community. And there are some moments where I practice the rest as resistance, and I sit back. And I think that's something important, is where are you directing your energy, and to choose it very intentionally, because you're not a machine and you're human, and you have to have those moments to refill your cup so that you can show up as your best self.
Oh, that is so beautiful. One of the first take-home messages I got from what you shared is, y'all don't mess with the mirror, because her dad had these hands and God. So y'all better leave the mirror alone if y'all come closer. But I love the other part of what you shared. I think sometimes in our culture holistically, but particularly when we get into exceptionalism within the Black community, rest is seen as counterproductive when it's actually very productive. It's what allows us to keep moving forward, to keep being fearless, to keep showing up time and time and time again, to be able to not just think about ourselves, but to think about those who went before us and those who will come after us. And so with that, I want to transition to our last lessons, and we'll ask our panelists to come back one more time before we end today, and really think about this journey. And so we've talked about where we've been historically, historical trauma, and understanding where we have grown to be, radical healing, and being able to incorporate some of these components. And talking about both sides of my grandparents and father and mother, and how they made the people who eventually became my parents, who one day met at Howard University, and from that union between this social worker and this future social worker and this future vice principal came a marriage that created me. And one of the things that really, as I was reflecting on lessons from the Black experience and moving forward, is thinking about what people have done to ensure that I could be in this seat right now, to ensure that I could be in front of you as a CEO of a company that is working with companies around the world, that is talking right now with some phenomenal panelists. And I think about that journey. And one of the things that stand out in my mind is I have my PhD, and both of my parents received their PhDs around the same time as me. They were in school almost my whole life. And I think about the journey that they took in order to get to that place, from their parents, who are my grandparents, to their journey at Howard University, to eventually being able to allow me to be in a position where I could advocate for myself, where I could have the words to be able to honor them and honor this legacy. And so one of the aspects of emotional intelligence that I think is so important for us to understand is, how do we connect each workplace decision with a greater purpose that positions someone else for success? This is something that I think is embedded within much of the Black community, especially as you get into corporate worlds or school spaces. You're thinking about, how do I position the next generation, the people who come after me, for success? And if that's informing each of your decisions as you're moving forward, that shifts the way your calculation, how you protect your mind and your energy, your peace. It impacts the way that you even support and think about yourself. I think about my personal journey and my journey connecting with even diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll be honest, I'm going to be transparent right now. Early in my career, I was hesitant to talk about issues related to the Black community, partially because I thought that by doing that, I would pigeonhole myself as the psychologist who only talks about Black things. And I knew I had much more of an expansive potential contribution. But what I learned was that was a way that is outside of our awareness sometimes of how our systemic racism and how the stories and narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves and how we show up was really impeding who my authentic self was. Because what I was raised to be was someone who not only spoke about issues within the Black community, but advocated for them, and advocated for them in a way that was connected with compassion, seeing the full humanity of not just Black people, but the culture as a whole. And so one of the tools I would love for you all to think about is, how do you start to connect all of your workplace decisions, whether it's the one-on-ones between supervisors and their direct reports, whether it's the staff meetings, whether it's the product lines you have coming out with, how do you connect that with decisions that are really connected with a greater purpose? Because here's the truth. When you're able to do that, you're able to create what we call a compassionate, communication feedback loop. And there's a couple of tools I want to share with you all. What you see on the screen and what we've been talking about today is something our team has come up with called the 3 A's. It's the 3 A's for being able to create a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging focused workplace, a compassionate workplace. And when we talk about compassion, we're talking about seeing the full humanity of people. Part of the reason why it's hard for us to have these conversations is because we're afraid to have brave conversations that are talking about race or gender or our wellness and well-being. And part of the reason why we're afraid to have these conversations is because there's fragility. Fragility is this hypersensitivity to topics that I may not know a lot about, or I may not be able to fully engage, or I don't have the answers to. And part of the reason why that fragility comes into place is because you don't necessarily have the resilience to be able to withstand a really uncomfortable conversation. You don't have the emotional intelligence skills to deal with the stress that comes with that conversation. You may not feel like you have the tools to be able to repair damage if damage occurs in that relationship. But here's the truth. When we're able to draw on the resilience that has come from the Black community, that's come from so many communities, historically oppressed communities, we can replace fragility with resilience and begin to start to have these brave conversations. Now, that can be a whole webinar within itself, but what I really want to do is invite our panelists on one more time, and I would love to hear from you all about how you are reaching for a greater purpose as a whole in your work and how that's impacted your trajectory and how it's impacted you in the past. And if there were one lesson that you wanted to share with folks as we leave here today from the Black experience around well-being, would love to hear that. Let's start with Jarrell on this question.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that, but I think about my grandfather who drove a bus in Philly for over 30 years. And when he reflects on his experience, he talks about the importance of relationship building, and that for lots of Black people, relationships with others are the ways that our families move forward and get ahead. And it's funny because I graduated from Cornell and we were at my graduation in Ithaca in the middle of nowhere, upstate New York. And so many people recognized my grandfather. Now, he had no business. He had never even been there before, but because he spent so much time driving that bus and actively trying to get to know people, and so many of those people helped us out with lots of different things, from cars to food to connections and that kind of stuff, those things stick. And so for me, it's something that I channel in my own work. And it wasn't until this exercise of kind of reflecting on that and talking about it with my friends that you realize that we do carry all these lessons from our grandparents within us. And when you put some pressure, it kind of comes out. My grandfather used the analogy of like toothpaste, like, well, you don't know what you got inside you till you put pressure on that container, and then all the lessons come out. And so I spend a lot of time at work focusing on relationships, because nothing in tech happens in a vacuum. You need engineers, you need product managers, you need data scientists, folks who don't look like me, who never experienced the things that I've experienced, but you need them to get the important work done. And when I'm gone and away, these folks who are left behind are going to need those relationships to carry them forward too. And so one of the lessons from my experience that I would want companies to think through, and kind of going back to what I talked about at the beginning, is this experience of being the first and only. And that for a lot of us, we are there and we're experiencing lots of challenges for many different reasons. So I would encourage them to think through, how do they support individuals like me, whether it's peer groups and our mentorship opportunities, either through ERGs or elsewhere. So we take off the pressure that we were talking about at the beginning, the pressure of having to navigate a new organization and perform, while also navigating the microaggressions and unfortunate encounters there. And just flagging that, like Courtney and I worked together years ago, and the conversations that we would have and support each other, being some of the only Black people at our organization globally, were invaluable and became part of the reason why I decided to stick around for as long as I did. And I don't think companies actually know how important it is for folks to feel like they've got someone they can be honest and be themselves with, especially in a new organization.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I so appreciate that. And Jarrell, you have analogies for days. I love it. The toothpaste, we got the mosquitoes. We got some good gems here leading us out. But that's so important to acknowledge that role. And given that you shouted out your former colleague, let's go to Courtney next and hear some of your reflections on these questions.
Yeah, so I think the biggest lesson that companies can take, and it's definitely going back to what Jarrell is saying about our experience together, is the need for community, right? So I'm only here today because I have a community with Jarrell going back to when we worked together. And one thing, going back to my grandfather again, one thing that he really instilled in me was the value of community. And, you know, when he and my grandmother moved from Virginia all the way over to California, a story that they would continuously tell is that when someone wanted to come from Virginia or Louisiana or whatever it was, they would bring them over, set them up an apartment, put furniture in it, get them a job wherever my grandfather was working, which was usually at the sanitation place or on the port as a longshoreman, and set them up. And that's how they built their community here in California. And I think that that's reflected in the lessons now that we carry over into tech. When I came in to Twitter, Jarrell pulled me aside and I was like, who is this man with these dogs? Like, why is he talking to me? But, you know, we built a community and that community has sustained us well beyond where we started at, and will continue to sustain us. So I think that's a big lesson that companies can take from the Black experience is that, you know, a lot of these corporate spaces are set up to be adversarial, where, you know, a person cannot advance unless you are in direct opposition to your teammates and your colleagues. And that's the only way to advance in a company. And I think that, you know, if we were more community focused and community minded, we would have a much healthier culture within these systems, and people would be able to advance much more than they think that they could, and if they were adversarial. And we see that the work would get done better. People would be a lot more collaborative when they're looking at somebody as a community member versus, you know, an adversary or a enemy. So I think that's a huge community. You know, Black people, we do not ascend without community. It cannot be one. So I think that's a huge lesson that these companies can take away from the Black experience.
That's so powerful. We do not ascend without community. And while that's a Black lesson, that's an everybody lesson that we need to bring into the workplace and have it as a part of the culture. And so speaking of the culture, Amira, would love for you to bring us home with your reflections on these questions.
Yeah, commitment and community. Thank you for that, Courtney. You know, I grew up understanding from the very earliest years of my life what it meant to live in purpose and community. For a period, my parents were missionaries on the tiny island of Guam, USA. And so I spent the formative years of my life humbly in community with the locals, right, who had needs and wants, and we strived every day to help meet those specific needs. And in Guam, there are many sugarcane fields. And one of the things we used to do as kids is we would stamp down the sugarcane into these circles and we would play in them. And there were always new kids coming, and we would stamp down more and we'd expand the circle. We'd invite people in, we'd stamp down more, we'd invite people into the circle. And that idea of community really resonates for me too, because that's what I've always known in my life is there's always an opening and there's always the ability to expand the circle and invite others in. You know, are there any actual barriers to expanding your circle in corporate places? No, they're perceived. What can we do to find a tool to expand the circle, invite others in? And I think another lesson from my childhood and my parents would be, they always told us, you leave people in places better than you found them. Whether you're leaving the dinner table, you clean up. If you're playing at someone's house, you better clean up. Wherever you go, you leave people and places better than you found them. And I think if we can focus on that and the humanity of others, inviting them in, you know, we can keep advancing equity and allowing for people to thrive as themselves and to show up authentically. So that's a lesson that I hope people hear and take with them, to really focus on leaving people and places better than you found them.
Y'all about to make real tears, thug tears. Tears come down right now. That is so beautiful. And as we wrap, and you all can stay on screen so folks can see your wonderful faces as we wrap today, some next steps for everyone here. Explore your workplace stressors and how they're connected with important identities, and do that benefits and burdens analysis. Employ these 3 A's to really start building language in the workplace for inclusivity, a common language around that, and build a culture of resilience that starts to replace fragility with resilience, so you can start having these brave conversations and having your staff understand their purpose. We want to give you all some resources to support you in this. If you like to kind of see this again, this is being recorded, you'll be able to see it again, but you can also get in contact with us here. One of the resources that we want to give to you is this 3 A's for the workplace, wellness and racial justice. Get in contact with us, we'll get that to you. We also have an executive leadership course, which is an 8-week course, intensive course, where you get executive coaching and you really talk about how to become the leader that creates this kind of environment. That's starting this spring, March 10th. And then we have our Free Minds Festival, which brings together wellness and equity. We encourage you all to come. It's April 29th, 2022, to lead into mental health month this year. But with that being said, we're right at the hour. If folks have questions, feel free to throw questions in here. We won't answer them here, but we'll get some answers to you. But with that, we're going to go out like we started with a little bit of Aretha playing for us. And I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Show folks respect and show our panelists some love.